Well, after about 3 years of doing this by myself, it finally dawned on me that we can really multiply the effect if I take the time and get everyone on the same page. In the 3 years that I've been doing it, I've talked to, I think, 46 different groups, 2 contractor groups, the rest have been architects. And the contractor groups have been recent, Clark Construction and Turner. And I really wondered what the hard hats were going to be thinking of an environmental presentation. And the hard hats were every bit as interested as the architects. They were really engaged in it. I did 2 groups at Clark, and just when I was in Los Angeles, did the Turner Construction office in LA. Not a twitch of cynicism or skepticism, and again, some really very, very good questions. From an architectural standpoint, I first started out with HOK, and it was interesting. I went in with just flash drives instead of the typical how high can you pile the table with samples, and then just talk only about samples. And over the years, the presentation has always been well received. I think I've modified it after every presentation because of a question or something that I felt I didn't cover effectively. And even though we've had the approved AIA presentation since December of 2012, yes, December of 2012, it's gone through the same somewhat obsessive modification after each presentation. This is the culmination of quite a bit of environmental work, and for most of you, I believe you know it, but I'm just simply going to go over it because what gives us, so to speak, as a company, an authoritative voice within the architectural community that would say that, please listen to CS. What are our roots? And I actually had to spend some time to get them in order, so to speak. As many of you know, our environmental position began in 1990. In September of 1990, the local newspaper headlines read, "Hazardous waste incinerator to be sited in Allenwood." And that awoke the whole community. And we became as a company, very modestly involved financially with a group called Organizations United for the Environment. That group included also 2 people from here, Steve Fisher, who at that time was our environmental management system, health and safety director, and Dave Leidecker, both of whom became very, very active in that environmental group. In 1995, the permit was denied, and Dave and Steve knew that in advance of the headlines, so they're in there telling me all about it. And our conversation then moved to, well, it's probably just going to go to someone else's community, someone that isn't as organized as this community was, and our relief could be someone else's agony. Then just within minutes, the next question we asked ourselves was, where's our hazardous waste going? A few minutes later, the question was, why do we have hazardous waste? Why do we need to have hazardous waste? That began a journey for us that we began eliminating certain chemicals, and we were first interested in eliminating persistent organic pollutants and hazardous air pollutants. They're generally the ones that have an effect on greenhouse gas, and they're generally also more toxic. By 2003, we had made some really good inroads to landfill avoidance, tracking and effectively reducing chemicals. And in 2003, we received the Pennsylvania Governor's Award for Environmental Excellence. That was a marvelous encouragement for our work, and I think that really helped to fuel and give us some confidence. Also in 2003, Meg and I were at a California Sustainable Hospitals conference, and it was there where we're sitting there and we're listening to this architect speak, and the architect says, and by the way, Acrovin is really a crummy product. And just about fainted at that point in time because the auditorium was pretty well filled. After the presentation, I went up and spoke to Robin Gunther, who had given that presentation, and said, "Hi, I'm Howard Williams with Construction Specialties, and we make Acrovan." And she said, "I need to talk to you." Wasn't necessarily the reaction I thought I was going to get. I almost thought I was going to get, either she was going to be terribly embarrassed and apologetic, which she wasn't, or she was just going to, hammer a little harder. And so we made an appointment to meet with her in her office in New York City. I came back and reported that. And the first reaction I got out of corporate was, "We are going to sue her into oblivion." And I suggested that that's probably not a good idea. Why don't we first talk to her? Well, strangely enough, that grew into a 10-year friendship. The last time I saw Robin, she said, "Hey, we're about ready to celebrate our 10th anniversary." And but we laugh about it. She is certainly one of the global leaders, truly global leaders within the environmental, the healthcare movement, and chemistry and safer chemistry. So that was 2003 for us. Also, that was a time when we came out after we were in California to meet with Kaiser. And Kaiser Permanente was saying, "We're getting rid of PVC in our buildings. We've had an incinerator at our site," Kaiser saying this, "and we've been incinerating the waste products from health, and the majority of those products are PVC. And when you incinerate PVC, you create dioxin, and dioxin is, let's see, history-wise, Russians wiped out one of their double agents by dousing them with dioxin, and he died a few weeks later, a very agonizing and painful death. And if I'm not mistaken, dioxin has some connection with Agent Orange. It's in that family, and I could be corrected on that. But it's a very potent cancer causing. And Kaiser looked and said, "Wow, we're supposed to be delivering healthcare, and we're burning all this stuff, and we're dropping the particles as well as the smoke and the gases into the communities that we're serving." So they began to do a lot of research about PVC and decided they wanted to eliminate PVC from their buildings. And in doing that, we had a national agreement with Kaiser. It was worth about $1 million a year. And they explained to us, "We would like you to develop an alternative to your PVC Acrovan. We give you 1 year to do that. If you cannot do that, you don't have us. And by the way, you have to sell it to us at the same or lower price." Well, they mentored us through that, and we created Acrovan 3000 as an alternative, and we began selling that to Kaiser. On to 2005. There's a lot of controversy, of course, at that point with PVC. And if we get to about 2005, the U.S. Green Building Council was considering a negative point if you used PVC. It was going to be a minus if you had PVC in your building. Then there was, again, quite a bit of controversy. The American Chemistry Council, the Vinyl Institute fought it, and the U.S. Green Building Council backed away from that. Also, at the time, as we were advertising our non-PVC, we received a letter from the Vinyl Institute. And the Vinyl Institute is, of course, that lobbying body of the American Chemistry Council of the makers of PVC. Ron Dad received a letter from them saying, "Stop saying non-PVC. If you don't, we will sue you. And you will regret it because we have lots of money and lots of power." And kudos to Ron. He wrote back, "I acknowledge the receipt of your letter. However, we will continue forward with our program." And the Vinyl Institute went away. They stopped their threats and they didn't sue us. By 2007, Robin Gunther and a lady by the name of Gail Vittori wrote Green Guide for Healthcare. And the Green Guide for Healthcare was written because LEED was not moving effectively forward with the healthcare guidance. The healthcare architects were seeing that healthcare presents a different set of issues. It's definitely a vulnerable population, and LEED was not addressing harmful chemicals and building products. So Green Guide for Healthcare was written, It's also when we joined, we received an invitation to join an organization called the Business NGO. NGOs are non-government organizations. They tend to be the nonprofits that are there with a purpose, and their goal is usually to affect some change within society or government. And the Biz NGO, it's called Business NGO for Safer Chemicals and Sustainable Materials. We were invited to join that, and in the joining of that began to learn a bit more about materials, health safety. The group includes, at that time, included Johnson & Johnson, Nike, Apple, Hewlett-Packard, Staples, and it also included a number of NGOs, such as the Environmental Defense Fund, cancer groups, groups that were working with electronics and trying to get safer materials, lead-free solder used in electronics. We began to be mentored and began to study and learn. It's also then that in 2007, Lead for Healthcare was brought out. And there was going to be a point in there for eliminating, for materials that would reduce persistent bioaccumulative toxins, reductions of PBTs. That was ultimately defeated by the American Chemistry Council. So then we move into 2008, 2009, we received our first cradle-to-cradle certification with Acrovin 3000 and entrance fluorine also at that time. We joined Practice Green Health. Practice Green Health is an organization that works purely with healthcare facilities to make their environment healthier. Green cleaning products, sustainably harvest food, non-genetically modified foods, looking at the wholeness within healthcare. By 2010, we had been invited, the United Nations saw a video interview that a group had taken of me and me chatting away. So we were invited to present at the UN as to what we were doing. The United Nations Program on the Environment has in place that by 2020, and I think this started in the somewhere perhaps around 2005, 2004, the United Nations Program on the Environment put together an initiative that said by 2020, chemicals that are used in commerce will be safe for people and the environment. Their goal was to have safer chemistry in place by 2020. And they invited me because they had chosen 4 areas to focus on. We had done a lot of market studies and hired consultants. And the 4 product areas that the UN was focusing on was toys, children's toys, which of course has always been getting a lot of play, lead, harmful chemicals in children's toys, electronics, textiles, and construction materials. Construction materials, the construction industry in the US is about 14% of our gross domestic product. So pretty big part of the economy. And I don't know what part it is of the world economy, but I would think it's somewhere, definitely I would think less than 14% of the global economy, but still a very high component within the global economy. And when the UN tackles those 4 areas, electronics, textiles, toys, and construction products, they are definitely focusing in on a very large part of the global economy. We launched in 2010 Acrovin 4000. We stood for a period of time kind of with one foot in the canoe and one foot on the dock, and I actually saw someone do that once at a state park. And I think they stood there for about 3 minutes. I was on a paddle boat out in the water, and this poor guy standing one foot on the dock and one foot in the canoe. And it was just this slow motion, just going in the water. Well, that's kind of where we were. We had a non-PVC product. We were advocating for safer chemistry and safer materials, but that was only a minor part of our Acrovin business. The majority of it was PVC. So we worked through 2009 and 2010 to create an alternative and to gain corporate approval to make 100% switch from PVC to non-PVC Acrovin 4000. We announced that at Greenbuild in 2010. And 2011, January, we switched over to that. We also at that time received an award from Practice Green Health, which we've been able to, I think we're 5 years in a row, have received Champion for Change Award, because we as a company are doing the things within our business and within our products that are parallel to what the hospitals are doing within Practice Green Health. And that's, to me, is a really good recognition. We adopted a chemicals policy and made it part of our ISO 14001. ISO 14001 is a framework in which a business can manage its environmental impacts and aspects of everything it's doing. And we embedded a chemicals policy into that so that we would get ahead of things, that within R&D, as we design products, and as we look out here on the manufacturing floor, and as we face out to our customers, that we would know what's in the product, we would know it, we would disclose it, and we would be constantly trying to improve our position within that. We would avoid the hazardous materials, and also that we would advocate for policies and legislation that would be in favor of doing that and creating that change. It was also at that time that we were invited to Senate and House to testify and talk about revisions to the Toxic Substance Control Act that was written in 1976. And there are, in commerce, you can hear either two numbers, generally speaking, between 60,000 and 80,000 chemicals in commerce. The EPA is virtually powerless to regulate those chemicals. So far, the EPA has been able to regulate 5 of the chemicals. EPA tried to pull asbestos out of the marketplace and was defeated in the court because they did not have the legislative authority to remove asbestos from commerce. So if you think for a moment that the EPA is kind of watching what's going on, they are, but they're in a sideline position that cannot do anything about it. And there's been Senator Lautenberg from New Jersey sponsored legislation that would update that law. And that legislation has been battered back and forth for 3 years. So then we move into 2011. 2011, we received the Region 6 EPA Award for Environmental Excellence, and Region 6 takes in 4 or 5 states. Pennsylvania, Delaware, I forget the other ones. Maryland, I think. Continued to have some, the awards. We launched our transparency site at that point in time. And I think if you're not familiar with that site, that's a good site to go into. We launched first with entrance flooring. We launched that at Greenbuild, and then followed the entrance flooring transparency with Acrivon, and we'll be bringing the other products into that site also. We were approached to participate with on an advisory council for innovation for the Center for International Environmental Law. You think, whoa, like where'd that one come from? And it's a group of people that I had a chance to meet at some of the UN meetings, and they liked the CS position in what we were doing and advocating, and simply asked that we review some of their publications. And the Center for International Environmental Law, of course, is exactly what you would imagine. They're working very heavily for safer chemistry, safer materials. They recently did a research that shows that the chemical companies that are fighting these changes are actually behind the scenes innovating. And the group did research on patents for new chemistry, and the number of patents now for new chemistry is like a spike rise. So the chemical companies are behind the scenes doing a lot of work in that regard, and fighting it very strong here in the U.S. In Europe, they don't have, they can't. The legislation is so strong that they actually can't fight it. Examples, Johnson & Johnson's No More Tears shampoo. has a chemical in it that actually the reason that the children don't cry is the chemical in it paralyzes the eye. So you can't cry. And the chemical is harmful. In Europe, the No More Tears shampoo in Europe does not contain that chemical, only here in the US, because Europe won't allow it. So you begin to get a sense of, sounds a little goofy, doesn't it? Sounds a little crazy, some of the things that are going on, but nonetheless they are. By 2012, we had some Cradle to Cradle Gold, and all 4 of the interiors business units working toward Cradle to Cradle. We then also at that time, we were looking for an environmental, someone that would be able to work with us to put together an environmental plan for the facility. And it was at that point that we hired Sarah Street as an intern. And she used the site or the environmental plans for our facilities as her capstone project for her master's in landscape architecture. Of course, we're now beginning to implement that plan. And at some point in time, when I'm much older and a little more tottery, I sincerely hope someone wheels my chair into the parking lot and I get to see some of it. But it's a very long-term plan. Some of this really, it's going to be 50 years before some of the canopy from the major trees that will be planted in the back. It's going to be 50 years before that comes to fruition. And then this year, continuing on the C2C, Practice Green Health Awards, the U.S. Green Building Council held in January their first summit on building materials and human health. There were 100 people invited to that. There were NGOs, there were universities, architects, and there were 4 building products manufacturers invited. And we were one of 4 that were invited and had an opportunity to spend 3 days in breakout sessions and planning and conversations as to where this may go. It was also this year, just in May, LEED version 4 was approved by 87% of the voting membership of the U.S. Green Building Council. And in October, some of you may remember there was a documentary group here a few years ago videoing for a documentary. That documentary was launched at the Marin Film Festival. The documentary is entitled The Human Experiment, the basis of which is chemical companies have essentially been, from that vantage point, experimenting without our permission. And the increase in the rise in cancers, in autism, in Parkinson's, in Alzheimer's, and neurodevelopment issues, fertility issues, more and more information is coming into play that the environmental chemicals in our world have had an impact on us. And we have all of a 3-minute cameo. After 3 days of videoing here, they boiled it down to a 3-minute cameo. But the cool part is that it's not important that we have the 3 minutes. It's really important that we're a part of it, but the story that they tell. So once this gets released, there are some extraordinarily poignant moments in that speak of some of the issues that people are going through on a day-to-day basis with that. And then, of course, today is Kendra's first day. We've wanted an environmental management person to manage our environmental systems, to keep our cradle to cradle up to date, keep our website up to date, keep teaching and reaching out as we go forward to add a level of focus to it. And after a fairly long search and at least 1 or 2 interviews, I'm sure, Kendra joins us. Kendra has a bachelor's, she's the sustainability coordinator. She has a bachelor's in physical and environmental geography. And I'm there, okay. My daughter has a bachelor's in environmental science. Okay, that made sense. Then I had to really understand environmental geography. And once I realized that it links how we relate to the environment and the people end of things, I'm thinking, why did they call it geography? But there's a deeper science to it. And I really like that it brings the people perspective into it and how the environment relates to us and we relate to the natural environment. And I think that those qualities of study are going to be really very helpful for us. Some of Kendra's responsibilities will be to maintain the transparency site, to really stay on top of our cradle-to-cradle certifications. There's renewals we've missed in the past. We've missed some renewal dates, and we've had expired certificates. We need to keep the transparency site up to date. We're also looking at beginning to do some environmental reporting. We really aren't out and about with a sustainability report, and more that's becoming important as it moves into our world. It's generally been the very large corporations, the Fortune 500s, that were doing sustainability reports, but we have enough going on that we can begin to do sustainability reports. Life cycle assessments. Life cycle assessments look at from point of extraction to life use of the product. And that's an area where we're beginning to get some questions. Have you done a life cycle assessment on your products? What can you answer about that? And then looking also at sustainability initiatives that we can add. We do everything from our little carbon sequestration now to a sophisticated environmental landscape plan to all the way down to collecting wine corks. So it's a lot of things and in between, but it's been sort of ad hoc. So Kendra's going to be able to focus this, get it aligned more strategically, and then reach out with some other initiatives. Water is a very powerful thing within the environmental world right now, and rightly so. We're draining our aquifers, but we're not putting water back into them. And that's going to be a very strong position. Restoration of the built environment, which is what we're doing relative to our landscape plan. That is an area of focus that's gaining momentum within the architectural community. So we're at a very good point on that. I think next year we will be in a position to begin inviting architects in here, not only for that, but obviously to look at our materials, look at our testing. I think we have a lot to offer, and now we can also bring in these other aspects and attract visitors to this obscure corner of the world that can only be reached by a commuter in a 2 or 3 hour drive. And it's rather challenging, but I think these are going to be areas of interest that the architects will find engaging, and will also be able to talk about products. And also, too, there are a number of things that I've not been able to be involved in the business NGO teleconferences as often as I would like to recently. So we're going to be able to get Kendra working on that. And we belong to a Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, which again is advocating and promoting the use of safer materials in commerce. So that brings you up to date, history-wise. And with that, do you have any questions before I start on the AIA presentation? I'll walk through it and stop me at any point. This doesn't have to be just through the slides. Stop and discuss, because this is going to be for you to present and for you to be talking with your customers, with your architects, and to be able to get that word out there further, faster. I've really not had a problem getting into the architects to do these presentations, because this presentation will also count for one credentialing maintenance point for LEED, because it's a live presentation, and we have the documentation for that. And then, of course, it's also an AIA, 1 hour. These are mandatory slides, and this you don't have to spend too much time on. It's simply a mandatory slide. This one requires a little bit of spend some time on, and these are positions that sustainable architecture requires sustainable materials and sustainable manufacturing practices. The reason I put that in there, this much of the sentence everyone understands. If you're going to have sustainable architecture, you have to have sustainable materials. What I'm really trying to put forth, and I've found in these 3 years, the architects, designers, and contractors are really take a hold of, is that then there also should be sustainable manufacturing practices. You could create and sell a very environmentally responsible product if you looked only at the product. But then you could be an environmental bum if you were hiding everything. So sustainable manufacturing practices are important. Additionally, Architecture 2030, the 2030 project for the AIA Committee on the Environment, is that by 2030 buildings will be carbon neutral. 45% of that carbon neutrality comes from the building product manufacturers. So we're going to talk further in here at the end as to what we're doing relative, although it's not in the presentation, as to what we're doing working toward that 2030 and our position on that. Why don't I do that now so I don't forget it? As part of Cradle to Cradle, we are offsetting our electric. Certain percentages are electric, in some cases 50% or 50%, and then also as part of our LEED Silver for Hughesville. That required that we offset 100% of our electric that's used within the offices. So no matter what product group it is here, we've been offsetting 50% of our electric by purchasing Green E certificates from a wind farm in the Dakotas and offsetting that 50%. Early this year, within the first quarter, it wasn't January, perhaps February, we began to offset our CO2 from the natural gas that we use in our facilities, the propane that we use within our forklifts, the gas that we burn on our trucks going back and forth, and our air travel, as well as any reimbursed staff travel and car rental. We're offsetting that CO2. And there we also buy CO2, we buy the offsets, the carbon offsets, which goes toward forest land acreage that has sufficient trees on it to be sequestering that amount of CO2. Additionally, Ryder Trucking does all of our shipping. Ryder subscribes as a part of the EPA Smart Way trucking. All trucks that are part of the Smart Way program are real-time satellite monitored for braking and acceleration, for efficient fuel usage, and all UPS shipments are offset. UPS does its own carbon offsets. So over 90, I think about 95% of our freight is carried on Ryder Smart Way trucking. So that's a very helpful contribution, and I think as we get a bit more sophisticated, we may begin to look at other areas of carbon offset, such as hotels and that part, just the part of our business. So again, for right now, we're offsetting our airfares. Everyone's expense, whenever there's an airfare reimbursement within the expense reports, Harry gets a copy of the airfare, he logs the miles, and we buy the carbon offsets or the Green E offsets almost as a debit. And then he simply debits against that, then he goes out and buys additional. HDR sent me an email last year saying they're beginning to look at what they need to do for the 2030 project. What's CS doing? And I responded with essentially the list and then added to it because we've installed the motion sensors here, and certainly they're in the factory in Hughesville as well as Montgomery, so that we have our motion sensors in play. We've done audits on the motor size of our equipment, the saws, etc., so that we haven't oversized the motors. Because if you've oversized the motors, then you're simply using more electricity than what you should be doing. So we've done a number of audits and a number of things within the facility to reduce our energy usage. The great part, you don't have to believe in global change. You can be a skeptic about global change. The really great part, though, about reducing energy is you immediately begin to reduce CO2 and you save money. So it's really like, why not do it? Second point on here is connecting environmental and human issues with the means of mitigation or elimination of causation. Now, we argue in the press and perhaps even over a cup of coffee about Obamacare. So we're worried about who's going to pay for it. And the reality is that if we use safer chemicals, safer materials that are being ever more linked to human health, we're approaching the causation issues. And while we're only a percentage of that, and maybe a very minor percentage, and our issue on it is there's 2 points within this whole chemical discussion. One is hazard and one is risk. We are pretty much a hazard-based decision making, and that is that if it's a hazard, it's always a hazard. Because the argument from the chemistry world and some other manufacturers is that, well, it may be hazardous, but it's not a risk to you. And the best way of describing that is you put a Bengal tiger right in the middle of there, and that's a very clear and obvious hazard to all of us. Put it in a cage, it's a risk. And that's really the hazard and risk discussion within the building products community right now. And that is, some hazardous materials can be so embedded into the product that they're not going to come out. You can't get to it. Our belief, though, is that down that supply chain, whoever makes the stuff that makes the stuff from which the stuff is made, someone somewhere is being connected. And there are systems and safeties in place to prevent those hazardous exposures. They're not, they're not stirring a big pot of evil stew and breathing it in and wiping out a community. But there are leaks, there are emissions from these processes, and it's a hazardous material. And it may well be hazardous in its origin or hazardous in its end, where it's then disposed of. Rigid PVC, as I understand it, our PVC plumbing pipes aren't going to hurt us. But when PVC is made, get on the website for EPA, vinyl chloride is a cancer-causing material. Dioxin is a cancer-causing material. So at beginning of life, end of life, there are issues associated with that. So we choose to take the hazard-based approach. There are some arguments that will say, you're being too strict. And every now and then I confess that we're faced with having to deal with, wow, what do we do for now? Because we don't have alternatives. There are specific scientific processes called alternative assessments that we do to seek out that alternative material and to lessen the probability of us coming up with something that some unintended consequence within that. So when we talk of eliminating causation, we're really believing that in many cases we're able to limit and or reduce causation from our practices and our behaviors. Again, is it a boiling the ocean kind of thing? We're doing what we think is our responsible part. Learning objectives. We simply want some people to understand what sustainable design is fighting to overcome so that they can be more comprehensive in what they're doing. A little bit of familiarity with chemicals of concern without having to be a chemist or a toxicologist, and that is kind of spooky because we're not. Familiarity with cradle to cradle so that they can advocate for it, and then a familiarity of what's going on in the world because some of the things aren't necessarily immediately known to our architectural community. These are our statements. Sustainable architecture is we're saying that tomorrow's going to have a voice in what we're doing today. We're going to behave sustainably. Cradle to cradle, footnote, cradle to cradle embraces a population growth and says we don't have to have scarcity today, or we don't have to deprive ourselves today in order that tomorrow can live abundantly. That creating abundance, there's a possibility to create abundance in this world, an abundance that's then available for future generations. And we believe that the extent to which we value the future generations, or the thought that we can have an effect and attend to tomorrow's voice, then we're going to set a course. And as we set that course, we set a course also somewhat for future generations. And that it's not necessarily a responsibility. I mean, while it is, but then in order to act on that responsibility, there's an opportunity to do that. So it's not just, we go around with the weight of the world on our shoulders, because there's something we can do about this. And that's what makes it exciting. And as we answer that voice, the opportunity simply continues to grow. We had an opportunity, speaking of which, to present to Foster Architects in London. And before, I tend to do research, always do research before I do an architectural presentation. I'm going to look at what are they talking about, on their sustainability. Who's doing it? How dedicated are they to that? And generally you can pick that up off of the architect's website. And I simply dug around in their website. Okay, Foster, he's one of the great building designers of the world, and he's wonderfully famous for it. But what makes him tick? They happen to have a number of his essays. So I started reading his essays, and this particularly spoke to my bias, and simply the ends are always social. It's a people issue, it's not a hardware issue. If it's hardware, then you make beautiful hardware, or you make beautiful things and you don't care about how people use them. But that's the antithesis of architecture. Architecture has always been it's a combination of art and engineering, and how then people relate to the building, and then how the building relates to people. So again, that was a comment that really appealed to me. And generally speaking, when that slide goes up and you look around the room, you have some heads nodding, and when you talk about, it's all about people. The USGBC website says that buildings are responsible for all of this. Kind of makes sense, because that's where people usually are. But that's a really, you begin to look at buildings from a slightly different perspective, in that, okay, yeah, it makes sense. Raw materials, you build buildings, waste, water, all that stuff. But the U.S. Green Building Council and many others believe we can do a better job, and we can begin to reduce these numbers. So essentially, I have to tell you, we had an outside group. I looked at a presentation and literally left that presentation with what I call slide envy, and decided that I needed to get my PowerPoint slides upgraded. And there are times when I'm not terribly comfortable with that being attributed to me, but be that as it may. The reality is that buildings aren't the cause. It's how we use buildings. We spend over 90% of our time in buildings, so it's how we use them. So if we can change how we use them, because that's where we all are, that's where we can change, and they're not the cause, they're the cure. When they're that large a part of our domestic product and they're using that many resources, we can begin to affect some positive change. Another bias is that we must understand the context and the relevance of an issue in order to act on it. If we just hear it and we go, oh man, and there's no way to act on it, our tendency is to be frustrated by it, and then we're just going to sweep it aside. But if we understand the context and the relevance, in I think it was 2007, I can't find the date, A gentleman by the name of Sandy Wiggins, who is on the U.S. Green Building Council board as well as the World Green Building Council board, put together what he called an executive overview of what's going on in the world, buildings and environment. And in it he listed 15 of the top environmental issues that are present in the world. 2% of our energy efficiency. You guys can look at this all at another time.
How many was that first one? So that came from a USGBC base
study.
In 2007, because when I read that, that was the only one that made me go, what, really, can you prove that? 2%?
Well, we've done some research. The wonderful thing is that Kurt and Christine have both vetted this list with separate research, so that we're not taking sort of the talking head and just stepping out there with something that you could just kind of get punched in the nose with. And separately, they've vetted this list, and this list is actually slightly changed because of their update and their vetting of this list. Now, the oil thing, the aquifers, get on, do a little research. It's really worth doing. The aquifers, you can Google blue the next gold, water the next gold. In central U.S., from Texas up through into the Dakotas, is what's called the Ogallala Aquifer. And the Ogallala Aquifer for a long time was about 350 feet deep with water in it. It's still 350 feet deep, but it only has in some places 50 feet of water. We've pumped it out for farming, we've pumped it out for a lot of other purposes, but we've not put it back in. A mitigation on this, and again I'm chattering, but from the Teach You standpoint, the parking lot in Hughesville has what's called storm tech chambers. They're almost the profile of an igloo, but then they're linked together. And the storm water goes into the storm tech chambers. And the reason it goes in there is that it can then perk down through the soil. The soil is this marvelous cleaning machine, and then it can be returned to the water table. As opposed to, let's get it into the storm sewer, let's get it into Muncie Creek, into the Susquehanna, into the bay, and into the ocean. That's not where we want it. We want it back in the aquifer. We're doing work out here as part of Sarah's plan that is going to take rainwater, get it back into the aquifer instead of pumping it out into the storm sewer that then goes down into the Susquehanna and the bay and the ocean. Get it back into the aquifer. Losing forest, overgrazing, topsoil blowing away. Only a small percentage. I think in Sandy Wiggins' report, he had 3 decimals and then a 1 as to the percentage of material that's actually used. I think one of the most interesting things cited is the population growth. We're adding 10 New York cities to the world every year. And if there's one area, that one point that would say behaving sustainably and responsibly makes good sense, we're making room for 78 million new neighbors every year. And we need to do that. We have the opportunity to do that. Our harvests are dropping, fisheries are being fished out, coral reefs are dead or dying. Would you believe that in Muncie, Pennsylvania, we can actually have an impact on coral reefs? And you say, you gotta be kidding me. We're so far from the ocean, it's pathetic. Farmland and farm waste and over-fertilization running into the Susquehanna creates problems within the food sources. And I know Kendra can explain this far better than I, but essentially we can have an effect on that. We support a local group called the Muncie Creek Watershed. We are their sole corporate contributor. They're a small group, and what they do is to create barriers where they'll plant trees, riparian barriers they're called, where they'll plant trees and vegetation that will filter that runoff and to keep that runoff from going into the streams and adding unwanted food sources. Ultimately, that unwanted pollution ends up down the Susquehanna, through the bay, and into the ocean. Is that the only cause of coral reefs dying? No, but it is an opportunity to contribute to the mitigation, because so much of what we're talking about is kind of the, should we let him in? Do you have Gabe locked away over there somewhere? Okay. So much of what we talk about is just an opportunity to mitigate. Is our little speck going to be seen? Maybe not. But we have an opportunity, and we have the means of doing it, and we have the purpose for doing it. But when you really look at it, it's kind of like, eat your veggies, but I'm not starving. And if we can put it into a context and into a relevance that is meaningful and that we can act upon, then it's a little less abstract than childhood vegetables. Study over the years, from my vantage point, is that there are really 5 primary components of sustainability. There are any number of subsets under that, but generally speaking, if we're working on these high points, then there are programs and mitigations under these primary sets that will allow us to act. And we as a company are acting on these 5, and those of you that have done some study and research within Cradle to Cradle will quickly recognize that there are also the 5 primaries within Cradle to Cradle. So I'm going to jump over into materials and chemicals of concern. That's a big focus within LEAD. And ultimately, we are all downstream of something. And if you're the sheep farmer, if you're selling the wool, it might not be bad to be downstream of the Rogaine factory. But otherwise, it's probably not a good spot. Also, footnote, we always go out and get permission, as well as we pay, it's like $25 to get the permission to use this for, let's say, 50 or 100 architects. So we don't violate copyright. That's another part that I think is important, that we're able to do the permission, and if asked, please know that we've gotten the rights to use these. Here's an interesting, worth reading. Environmental hazards may be partially responsible, linked to chronic diseases, perhaps as much as 75% of all healthcare expenditures. So as you think about mitigation, you also should become familiar with the Healthier Hospitals Initiative. There are a number of architects and a number of healthcare facilities that are members of the Healthier Hospitals Initiative. And one of their areas of focus is chemicals in building products, or chemicals in materials, whether it's, again, what they're using for housekeeping, what they're using throughout their facilities, as well as what they're buying product-wise. So if it's another place to look, if you're calling on a facility, calling on an architect that's building a facility that's a part of the facilities, part of the Healthy Hospitals Initiative. There are also like a bazillion labels. I think there are not a bazillion. I think it's actually only about 250 environmental labels of some sort that are out in the marketplace. The cool thing is they all have meaning, they all have purpose, but we don't have to worry about them, because within LEAD version 4, these are the only labels that matter within LEAD version 4. Green Screen for Safer Chemicals. Green Screen is a database of chemicals, and it's a program that allows you to go in and list your building material ingredients and get various scores. We're familiar with the Health Product Declaration in many cases. Health Product Declaration is a self-certified label, self-reporting label that was created by the Health Products Declaration Collaborative. I believe there are 30 or 30 plus architects that are a part of that, and their goal and their urgency is to have transparency of material ingredients. So the first option, and we're going to look at this a little bit further as we look at the LEAD descriptions. First option material ingredient reporting down to 1,000 parts per million. That means you know 99.99% of what's in the product, and in order to meet that ingredient reporting, you have to show what it is. And Cradle Cradle Basic and Cradle Cradle Bronze also qualify for that credit, as well as the USGBC left an opening for another label that they would approve. Option 2 goes into material ingredient optimization. Material optimization is simply that you've now known from option 1, your 1,000 part per million screening, you know what's in it. Option 2 is awarding a point for, now that you know what's in it, do something better, optimize it, go for safer chemistry. And here you'll notice that the health product declaration falls off. It's not one that can give, at this point, can give a point for option 2. And there were Cradle Cradle Silver, Gold, or Platinum. Footnote, apparently there are no Cradle Cradle Platinum products. It's not a label that's yet been issued. No one's attained that level. Also a USGBC, as well as International Alternative Compliance. So that opens the door for imports and companies that are working also within the European sector. The intent of LEED version 4, materials and resources, encourage products, materials, life cycle information, environmentally, economically, and social preferred life impacts, reward teams for selecting those products, inventoried in an accepted methodology, and to reward raw material manufacturers who produce verified materials. Option 1, 20 different permanently installed products. The great thing about LEED version 4 is that it now cares about exterior materials. It's now about all building types and all products. Previously, LEED with off-gassing was, their prior LEED versions dealt only with off-gassing. And off-gassing is simply coming from worried about what harmful chemicals are off-gassing that we're going to breathe or touch in the exposure. And now, any product. And the Cranford Group has louvers, sun controls. So they can now be part of that 20 products. And as you can see, green screen, health product declaration, cradle, 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 cradle. And they did split it out among 5 different manufacturers, so one of us couldn't hog all the glory. I think we can put 39 products together from our 8 cradle-to-cradle certifications. And that, again, was at the 1,000 parts per million. Disclosure and optimization. Here we're looking at 100 parts per million, and it's green screen, cradle-cradle, reach, as well as another option. Now you can only get 2 points in materials and resources, but there's also an option 3. And an option 3 is in place because what what LEED wants us to do is begin to drive this back up our supply chain, influence more people. And in this regard, at least with Acrovin 4000, the maker of our Acrovin 4000 resin is also cradle to cradle. But since we qualify on option 1 and option 2, there's not necessarily a need to go unless we want to boost things up a bit, because right now cradle to cradle would give us a point in option 3, and it would give us a point in option 2, which kind of blocks the health product declaration a little bit. We're hoping that that's going to become a little less competitive environment. Footnote, the health product declaration, the 30-some architects that are advocating and pushing that are giving webinars. They're sending letters that are saying that as of January, if you want to give a presentation to us, you better have a health product declaration, or we're not going to listen. And at January of 2015, if you don't have a health product declaration, we aren't even going to specify. We're going to give specification favor to those with a health product declaration. So some of those 30 are writing that letter. Some of those 30, like the Smith Group, are saying, well, Canon is writing that type of letter. The Smith Group is writing a letter that says, we're part of the Health Product Declaration Collaborative. We're advocating for transparency. We will give favor to the Health Product Declaration or a third-party certified declaration. So they're leaving that open. They're staying sort of true to their association with the collaborative by talking about that, but they will accept cradle to cradle. And then we have HDR very clearly saying we want transparency, want healthier building materials, health product declaration, and or cradle to cradle. And that if you have either of these two, come talk to us in January, you can get in. If you don't, you can't. And Peter Surratt is the chairman of the Health Product Declaration, chairman of the board of the Health Product Declaration Collaborative. Peter Surratt is a friend, and he, at the time he was with Perkins Will, helped us create our transparency site. So he knows us. And then, so I've spoken recently with him, and I've spoken recently with their executive director, John Knott. I met John in 2005. He is a developer. His family legacy is that the Knott family has been developers for over 100 years. And when I met him, he was doing what everyone else was talking about. He was doing a sustainable site. He was building green buildings. And that was just part of what they do. It wasn't even necessarily a question. So they are working to take some of the pressure off of us, where we're sitting here with C2C certificates on lots of CS product and suffering through this representative saying, well, my architect's got to be, got to be a health product declaration. You want to do a health product declaration. Essentially, to do a health product declaration is to go backward. It's self-certified, it's 1,000 parts per million, and 100 parts per million is the level at which the market and the environmentalists are saying, if you look at 100 parts per million, you have found every intentionally added chemical in your product. Everything else is just there. 100 parts per million is at the intentionally added level. If you look at carpet, you can have the nylon that's good, and then the pigments begin to get into some strange chemistry. If you look at acrylic, the resin, which is 94 to 95% of the material, is resin alone. The rest, it may be pigment, and it may even be down to where the resin accounts for 97 to 98% of the mass of the product. And the pigments then are these other 1 or 2% components. 16 pigments make up all of our 62 or 4 colors. And it's when you start digging around in the pigments that you might find a chlorinated material, and their MBDC doesn't want anything that has any link whatsoever with cancer. So that could be a red pigment. So we have several of our acrylic colors are cradle gold, which means there's no problematic substance in them. And then there's almost an equal number that are yellow, which there's some, or red rather, there are some problematic chemicals within the pigments.
Howard, can you, I'm trying to explain this to designers,
Mhm.
because I get confused.
Okay.
It doesn't equate 100 versus 1,000 parts per million when
Right.
you're dissecting materials. And I thought you had said at 1,000 parts per million, that takes care of 99.9%.
Yes,
So then what would at 100 be?
99.9999. Yeah. And it seems inconsequential. It really does. You would almost say, why not stop at 1,000? For crying out loud, 99.9, that's good enough for me.
Right, that's what.
Small amounts are very concerning. I used to take Claritin, and the Claritin pill I took was really tiny. I mean, really tiny, very small pill. And the majority of that pill was there so that I could get a hold of the active ingredient and get it in me, because the active ingredient is probably out to the 4th or 5th decimal place. And that active ingredient, that very small amount, stopped my sneezing, my itching eyes. There's also another, and I need to, there are other medications with such incredibly small amounts that actually create a rather profound change within our bodies. And there's this principle called small dose, and that for vulnerable populations, small dose is particularly of concern within healthy building materials. So to go to that finer screening, green screen, Europe, the European REACH standards, as well as cradle-cradle, and generally accepted in the environmental communities that are focusing on this, that 100 is really where you need to be. 1,000 is just, you're ignoring. You're ignoring space for some very bad actors. Did that help? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now here, within credit or option 3, is the only place that distance comes into play with lead. And in this credit point, if you're option 3 and you're within 100 miles of the site, you can account for 200% of the material value. So if you're familiar with lead on a percentage value. This report, it's 30-some pages. And the U.S. Green Building Council has done everyone an incredible favor. What they've done is to compare green screen, health product declaration, and cradle to cradle, and to harmonize it. If one says this, how does that compare with what the other two are doing? So how is that harmonized? And this, I think it's 30-some pages, 32-page report is well worth going to that site, downloading, reading, spending a little time in it, because then you're just going to get a better understanding of the 3 primary aspects of what USGBC is looking at. Now, if you grew up in my generation, your mom and dad could have put wallpaper in your room that had DDT in it. DDT was sprayed all over America and all over kids and anyone else that was standing around, and within a very short period of time had chemically sterilized the majority of our wildlife, and also is linked to birth defects and cancer. So from an unintended consequence, DDT was thought to be the great thing, and actually it became the cause for which the book Silent Spring was written, because it wasn't long before there weren't too many birds singing in the air. And I can remember growing up in this area that the DDT spraying along the streams and the highways, there was a very long period of time where all the rabbits, the squirrels, the birds left, then the predators left, the hawks, and there was a period of time, and I think that too would have been somewhat contributing to the eagle population decline, that as a boy, to see a hawk in the air, it was rare. And now, of course, as you go down 180, you're seeing those marvelous red-tailed hawks setting out everywhere, and it's not unusual now you're going to begin to see eagles But they're still finding DDT was very persistent, very bioaccumulative, and very toxic. So they're still finding DDT in the environment in spite of this being gone for many years. Unintended consequences of chemicals. The Environmental Defense Fund website is showing 6 chemicals of concern that we're finding in our products. The PFCs, if you're wearing a no-iron shirt, you've got PFCs in it. Bisphenol A, of course, that's been perhaps more highly seen. Formaldehyde in building products. Formaldehyde, and good grief, I thought that's what they preserved things with in lab. Formaldehyde really makes adhesives work great. So you'll find formaldehydes, or previously formaldehyde in wood products, plywood, carpeting. Phthalates. Phthalates are used to soften plastic. They're what makes vinyl flexible, but they also leach out. They're what you find on the inside of your windshield when you get in your car and it's all kind of gray looking, and you can wipe it off, or you can write your initials in your windshield even though it's on the inside, and you wonder how that happens. There are phthalates leaching out of your vinyl in your car. Toluene in the oil-based paints, and the fire retardants, flame retardants that are legislated to be in our furniture, in our mattresses, and our pillows. And one of those who advocate against the use of that asked the question was, when does someone expect their head is going to burst into flame, and that they would need a fire retardant in their pillow? But it all goes back to the time in which, if you want to do some research on that, Chicago Tribune, great expose on it, essentially saying that these chemicals have been promoted for simply growth in the chemical industry. I want to sell a lot of it. And when you think about it, we create a new product and we want to market the heck out of it. Well, that's what they did. They created a product, they wanted to market the heck out of it. And there's also a link to the tobacco industry, because there was a lot of concern about people falling asleep smoking, lighting the couch, lighting the bed on fire. So instead of talking about smoking, fireproof the bed, fireproof the couch. Some of the effects. This is the one that really, I think, hits home. 232 toxic chemicals found in umbilical cord blood. The womb was thought to be the safest place, and that our environment would never transfer across the womb into the baby, but it's coming in through the mother's blood. Now, in order to get hazardous materials in us, we have to ingest either through eating or breathing or drinking, or we have to come in physical contact with it. So there's a baby, fresh into the world, hasn't eaten anything yet, may have drawn its first breath, but not enough to get it into its umbilical cord blood, and hasn't touched. So you look at some of these rate increases. I think too, if you go into an autism site, you'll see that autism 10 years ago, autism was 1 in 1,000. Today, they're saying it's 1 out of 88. Is it because there's now a broader spectrum of autism that's being tested for? And is it because there's a level of sophistication to that that wasn't there? Likely so. The reality is, if we're seeking to mitigate, and if these numbers are only, what percentage would you want them to be correct? Would you act if they were only half right? Would you act if they were 25% right, and you had a chance to do something and try to contribute to something that, or to the reduction or the mitigation? My sense is that even if you wanted to say they were only 25% right, or better yet, 75% wrong, it's still worth doing. And that's, again, is a position that we've taken. A great site to go if you want to learn more. Safer Chemicals in Healthy Families is a group of groups. It includes the American Cancer Society, it includes the Breast Cancer Fund, autism, Parkinson's, neurodevelopment advocates, I think there are 300 or 400 separate groups that are part of this, and they've simply formed a group large enough, or what they hope is large enough, to be lobbying and to be informing at a level at least to get the word out around the American Chemistry Council. A great place, because I'm certainly not a chemist, definitely not a toxicologist, and most of us aren't. The ChemSec SIN list stands for Substitute It Now, and it's a great place to learn some answers. So when you go in, just click the database. Within the database, you can, and here I chose DEHP. DEHP is a plasticizer, and it'll say generally where it's found, what it's usually in, and what are some of the, what's the health assessment. And within the SIN list, there are criteria for substances of very high concern. We used a lot of acronyms. CMRs, carcinogenic, mutagenic, and toxic to reproduction. PBTs, or very persistent, very bioaccumulative, and substances of equivalent concern. They're generally what you're going to see if there's an issue with the material in that bottom part of, in this part. And that's all from the vantage point of Europe. We can do better. We can build better products. It's a solution-oriented thing. We can solve the problem, and design can do that. So we can design in safer materials and better chemistry. And that's really where we come to Cradle to Cradle. And part of the reason for Cradle to Cradle, and this listing's important, it's a practice, it's something you do, it's a philosophy. Philosophically, it's back to those 5 primaries, and what are we going to do and how are we going to act on them. It's a standard of quality, and it is an approach, a different approach to some of the standard problems. Material certification, that primary part that looks at the chemistry, simply does an inventory of what's toxic, what's not, places it in a plus-minus scale, seeks to minimize the negative, and optimize the positive effects. Also, it's basically about taking the simple part of our environmental world, the biological nutrients, rabbit eats, rabbit dies, food for more plants. Why can't the technical nutrients, why can't the man side of world also look at that, where you make it, you use it, take it apart, and make something else with it? Safe and healthy materials, material health. Eliminate the concept of waste. Not minimize it, absolutely eliminate it is where Cradle to Cradle would like to go. So material reutilization. When we were first looking at a non-PVC material for Acrovin, one of the things we looked at was fiberglass, a fiberglass pultrusion. It's essentially the way they extrude fiberglass. We quickly found that you cannot remove the resin from the fiber. And the only place that you could put the drop and the scrap from a fiberglass extrusion was the landfill. That did not in any way meet where we wanted to go. We wanted a material that could be reused, and that there are waste streams and means by which you can reuse that. That's a primary concept within Cradle to Cradle. Power with abundant clean energy. Water is precious. And then social fairness. Social justice has been a term that's been used for, I think I first heard that in the context of building products about 10 years ago. And you begin to think, okay, what's this social justice stuff? And the reality is, are you paying a fair wage? Do you have benefits? Can someone say, you know what, I think you just made a bad decision here? Or is there an open door policy? And are you using child labor? When we first went with Ping Ping into China and began working with a couple of manufacturers there, we went to every site. We physically went to the site. We wanted to see what it was like. we saw some sites that we just turned around and walked away from. Because there were sites where there were people literally squatting on the floor, grinding edges off of aluminum castings, one light bulb in the ceiling. The light bulb was plugged into an outlet with the wires stripped off and plugged into the outlet. You could barely see what they were doing. It was filthy. It was just really bad working conditions. And we said, no, we're not going to be part of that. So that's also what it requires, is you just don't take the price. Don't just take the price. Know what's going on. Are the people in China that make our carpet strips. I went there and thought, my goodness, does their mother know they're out of the yard? They look so young. And I really, really pushed Ping Ping very hard. How old are these people? Why aren't they in school? What's happening here? What's going on? And she finally convinced me that when you age, everyone looks young. But she did that very tactfully. And had some conversations with the owner through Ping Ping that these people were of working age within that society. That's a key part within that society. Our society may have different ages, but within that society, the working age, it was an appropriate working age, not within, or they didn't say 10-year-olds. These were teenagers in early 20s. Cradle to Cradle classifies ingredients. Cradle to Cradle has a banned list. But then if you see gray on the report, it's just not something that's been assessed yet. Then it goes red, yellow, green. And the good thing with a high-def TV is you can actually see the difference in the greens. Most of the time when you're just using a projector, they're both green, and I'm sure everyone's looking, okay, what's green, difference between green A and green B? The product, the ingredients are evaluated on the basis of human health. Now, banned lists. There are a number of companies, and we'll see them later on in the presentation, that have lists of chemicals that they do not want. Boom, period. Do not want these chemicals. And when I go back to when the USGBC was looking at banning PVC, I was so disappointed they didn't, and had written what I thought were two really great letters that they should have listened to, and somehow they didn't listen to me. And thought they'd made a bad decision. Ultimately, I think they made the very best decision ever. Now, they were a little bit slow coming to LEED version 4. It's a 6-year time frame. But what they ended up talking about were chemicals of concern, which are families of chemicals. And it's not restricted then. If you have a list and then something else is seen to go from a possible for causing cancer to a proven cancer, then you've got to add that to the list. So if you just simply begin to look at criterion and come down with a list that says if it's going to cause cancer, if it's going to disrupt our endocrine system, if it's going to cause birth defects, if it's going to be toxic, then it needs to be assessed. And these are the 3 stages. Either it isn't, or it is, or it isn't yet classified. If it's not known or not classified, you're okay. Now, it may be a suspected, but it's not yet classified. And then there are a series that are looked at from the natural environment. And that's where familiarity, we're putting together. We'll likely have this segregated into the website, but all of our cradle-to-cradle certifications, we're getting them all put together, because some of the architects that I've talked to have said, all I need to see is that certificate. I'm just happy as can be. That's all I need to see. Others are saying, I would like to see your report. I would like to see what are the reds. Let's see if this is the one. No, I don't. Let's see here. Because it also qualifies as a great disclosure document where I know it's in here. It has to be in here. Oh, yeah. Okay. it will have, whether it's a type C, which would be that yellow, or whether it's green, and it's very explicit. It also gives the overview of the material. So some of the architects are wanting to see that. When you go out onto our transparency site, it's all there. The reds, the yellows, the greens are there. I already talked about the UN project and the four product types that are being looked at there. The state of California has Proposition 65 that originally started out worrying about substances in drinking water. Now it worries about all sorts of substances, and it's a great long list. And you can go into Prop 65 and research. Give you an example of what we've done. When we were choosing the resin for Acrovan 4000, we had the possibility of buying it from Eastman Chemical Company in Tennessee. And when resins are made, there's a catalytic process, which I've already told you more than I know. But there's a catalytic process, and chemicals are used to catalyze the material in a can't even remember the name of the cylinders in which it's created. PETG that we use for Acrovan 4000 can be catalyzed with antimony trioxide or an alternative to antimony trioxide. Antimony trioxide is a cancer-causing material. We found, and it is less than, you would have to be going down to probably 10 parts per million to find the dioxide. But from our connections within the environmental community, they were focused on cancer-causing materials, and that antimony trioxide is what makes PETG or PET an unfavored plastic. We managed, though, to find out of Korea a PETG that is not catalyzed with antimony trioxide. Antimony trioxide is on the California Prop 65 list. So technically, if we had been using PETG that was catalyzed with antimony trioxide, and there is no threshold limit on that material, we would have had to put a label on all of the Acrovan sold in California, which would not have been a fun thing to do. That this contains ingredients that are under Prop 65. The state of Oregon has an executive order to purchase environmentally friendly product, includes building materials. One of our friends that's on the business NGO, that is vice president and chief senior chemist for Staples, was on the board that helped to write that. And he actually, of course, knowing what we're trying to do, thought, I need to get building products into that executive order also. So he managed to get building products inserted into the executive order on Oregon's purchasing. 28 states are considering, or were last year, considering toxic chemicals legislation. That's because the federal government has not been moving on chemicals legislation. Washington Department of Ecology, reduce toxic threats. They're very strong player in the environmental communities. Gene Hansen, architect, designer that we've known for a number of years, wrote this piece, and increasingly looking at architects and designers. The Green Guide for Healthcare that came out in 2007 had this statement in it that really captured our attention and made us begin to think that here's this inanimate building, and yet if it's built with safer materials, then it actually is as strange as it may be to cross over that divide, so to speak, and to say that the inanimate can actually begin to do animate things. But it's there, it's not just sitting there. It's sitting there with good materials, and good materials contributing to human health. And as simple as that process seems, let's not build a cancer treatment center with materials linked to cancer. Perkins Will tried, actually no, it was Gunther 5, which is Robin Gunther's original group, tried building a cancer treatment center with materials that were not linked to cancer. And they were trying to do that in the somewhere between 2004 and 2008. They couldn't do it. First of all, most of us as building product manufacturers had no clue what was in our material, because again, we lean back and say, well, it can't be bad. I mean, the EPA's there, so you can't have bad stuff. And they were unable to do that. We had an opportunity to present, and this was one of the slides, at MedAssets, and I think most of you are familiar who is MedAssets. They're a group purchasing organization focused on healthcare. And in the meeting was a person from, I think it was the Cancer Clinics of America or something, Cancer Treatment Centers of America. And at the end of the presentation, when I asked if anyone had any questions, he had the courage in front of a group of peers to say, I'm with the Cancer Treatment Centers of America. We never even gave that a thought. We never even thought that we shouldn't be building our buildings with materials that are linked to cancer. So this, it's not to say we enlightened him. What it is to say is, marketplace has a long way to go yet. There's a lot of awareness that needs to be raised in all of this. And LEED version 4 is going to be essentially the booster rocket linked to accelerating this forward. Living Building Challenge. The Cascadia, which is the northwestern region of the U.S. Green Building Council, created the Living Building Challenge. It's LEED on steroids. You cannot become a member of the Living Building something something institute unless your products, as a building products manufacturer, unless you are transparent. You cannot display at their trade show unless the products you're displaying are revealing their chemistry. And it's only a group of about 2,500. And Kurt's been going to those, and through Kurt's connection and discussions, we are now members of this group. And again, you need to be transparent. They have specific chemicals as opposed to families of chemicals that they're on their red list. Of course, we have the Health Product Declaration. PNC Bank out of Pittsburgh, large financial institution, large financial group. They are the single largest holder of LEED certified buildings in America. They have more LEED buildings than any other private group. And they want to know what's in it, what's in it, what's in it. You don't get your materials in their building without showing them what's in your material. Kaiser has gained in their sophistication where they're a very strong promoter of green chemistry. Green chemistry simply says that we can create safer molecules and put them together to create safer materials. And science can do that. Science just needs to think about what it's doing and get the toxicologists sitting with the chemist. Google, got to be transparent if you're going to sell building products to Google. Additionally, when the U.S. Green Building Council was very seriously and strongly pushing LEED version 4 with the materials and resources, the American Chemistry Council couldn't convince them not to do it, so the American Chemistry Council went to Congress and asked Congress to decertify the U.S. Green Building Council because there had been an executive order that said all federal buildings minimum of LEED silver. So the American Chemistry Council went and said, we're going to get you. We're going to take away a very large customer base. And when Google heard of that, Google donated $3 million to the U.S. Green Building Council for their war chest to fight and to, we're getting...
That light broke out there, the one with the two wires.
Yeah. We're getting some new furnaces. But that's a little noisy. So anyway, Google has a very strong position on that. The little shapes or pointer shapes are from the U.S. Green Building Council's website of about 3 years ago. The green lines are mine. LEED seeks to contain everything within the site and not let anything go outside of the site, whether it's light, whether it's water, whether it's noise. Very, very concerned about controlling things within the site. The great thing, though, is that when architects insist upon certain levels of behavior of building product manufacturers, when architects would subscribe to some of our base premises, and that is that tomorrow has a voice in today, and that we should today be doing these things to mitigate the health effects and to create sustainability. When an architect specifies and insists upon that, their influence goes well past the site. And all the green lines at one point, I got tired of trying to figure out exactly where Muncie was because the map was too small, and I think it's moved a couple of times. But essentially, the influence of the site and the influence of the architect goes back to Muncie, goes back to Hughesville, goes back to Montgomery, because they're supporting our behaviors and say that we're not just building good products, we're being good stewards in our local communities and good stewards for the environment. And the other great thing with Cradle to Cradle, although they don't certify companies, the behaviors are required of the company in order to reach the certification. And it is third party, it's audited, so there's also a large discussion, and there was recently a webcast live discussion about that the health product declaration actually raises the architect's liability. Because it's a manufacturer self-certified, then the architect has to make these decisions. And if they haven't used the best practice within the industry, architects are personally liable as well as corporately liable. So there's a very big conversation going on out there right now that's saying, maybe I don't want to use the health product declaration. Whereas we're third party, certified. McDonough Brungart, design chemistry, assesses the material, assesses our metrics and performance characteristics and behaviors, submits that report to the Cradle to Cradle Product Innovation Institute. They're the ones that hold the certification rights. And then the Institute says, here's the standard, here's the assessment, it all matches, we'll give a certification. It's like the UL that we use for either our fire barrier or for our Acrofen. Is it class 1? There's nothing within the building code that says it has to be UL. Nothing, except for expansion to cover fire barriers. But for Acrofen, it doesn't have to be class 1. I mean, it doesn't have to be UL, simply has to be class 1. So we could have done 20 tests on Acrofen, passed 1, and said, we're class 1. And then just not show the 19. UL requires that you do 3 tests in a row and that the 3 pass. And then they put their label on it so that every day, every piece of, and then annually, if there's a follow-up service, annually they're auditing to check to be sure that we're using, Acrofen 4000 is as it's claimed. They've visited our extruders, they visited here, and they're certifying that it is what it is. And that's really what Cradle to Cradle is doing. They're certifying that we meet all of our claims. Every 2 years we have to renew, and if we change anything within the recipe, we have to renew it. I like American history. And just at the last presentation, I said I was reading a very small book on presidential integrity. And then I thought, my goodness, is that a tale in itself? If you're talking presidential integrity and it's a little book. But anyway, Eisenhower was in there. And as I read his farewell address, as he's leaving office in 1961, I think it really speaks to what is this sustainability and how important it is. I'll let you read that, then I'll make a couple more comments on it. there are certain things that underpin society. I mean, we can just even be so simplistic as to say Maslow's base. Just simply look at Maslow's base. What underpins Maslow's base? What supports Maslow's base? Food, clothing, shelter. What is sustainability? Remove sustainability. Remove food. Remove clothing. Remove shelter. Remove systems. Knock a couple of pins out from under some of our worldviews. And if you just take worldview as our Constitution and Bill of Rights, property rights, rule of law, the freedoms that we enjoy. What supports? If we take away certain things, what creates the chaos that begins to erode Maslow's base? What creates the chaos that begins to erode society? Look at hurricanes that have created power outages for weeks, food shortages, no access to drinking water, no access to heat, and we see how things shake. Are we going to stop the world from falling apart? No. Are we able to act on a part of this? Yes. That is the essential ethos that the architectural community is looking at, because again, architecture has always been about creating spaces for people, good spaces for people, where people can actuate and where people can live and work comfortably within their built environment. So architecture has always had a strong sociological component to it, and the whole of sustainability is an equally strong sociological component. So we're not appealing to just fuzzy stuff. We're appealing to a high level of reality, and we're in a very good position to be considered, actually considered some of the leaders within sustainability. The architectural community sees us that way. I've asked at the end of every one of the presentations I've given, has this been meaningful? Did it help you? What could I do better? What could I say better? I've had architects say, we've known CS for years. We've specified your product. We've known what you are. Now we know who you are. And now that we know who you are, we will specify your product more often and we'll hold the specifications. Now, we've also had architects applaud midway through. First time that ever happened to me is midway through the presentation, a spec writer and a designer began applauding. It was kind of weird. Generally speaking, the answer back is, we now know who you are. And that's an extraordinarily powerful part, because that takes us from being not just a materials manufacturer, but someone that's partnering with them to achieve what it is they're trying to achieve, and to do it in an effective and comprehensive way that isn't just us chattering about it. We verify it. And in some cases, I've said, we're going to tell you what we're doing when you're not looking. And that usually brings a smile or two. But by the end of the presentation, we've told them what we're doing when they're not looking. And that's a very strong people-to-people connection. Still have a lot of those connections to make. And the hope is that you're going to be able to take this presentation out and use that to make those connections. So I'm open for questions. Let's see how much time we have. We probably need to take a little break. But I think we have about 15 minutes. Do we want to take a 5? Or do you want to, if you have any questions, or if you don't, that's fine too. I mean, maybe something you want to think about, may want to run through, and may want to ask questions separately. However, you may want to do that. Going once?
Thank you.
Going twice? Go. Yeah, I think some of you saw the architectural record and had a chance to look at that. And there's a great learning piece in there about Cradle to Cradle. The book Cradle to Cradle is a great read. And then in 2 weeks, we're being honored at a dinner in New York City, where, if I've read the email correctly, I sure hope I did, We're one of 6 companies receiving an award as Legacy Innovators, an award from the Cradle Cradle Product Innovation Institute. And my very favorite mayor in all America is going to be there, Mayor Bloomberg. He's not my very favorite mayor in all America. But anyway, that should be cool.
Does your presentation have the cliff notes?
No.
The reason I say that is you have a lot of stories,
Yeah.
and the stories make it, but it's.
So,
And
what's
then the other
video?
question is on AIA, can we mention, and you mentioned a lot of CS-based stories.
No,
How
you can't.
limited are you on?
You can wear your shirt.
Yeah.
No, you can have that label out there. At the end, you can talk about that. And I think it comes across that we actually, because of what we're talking about, that we actually know about this. And as we talk about cradle to cradle, at the end, I'll worm in the transparency site. And at the beginning, I may violate things a bit. I just do a bit of that introduction of mostly the hazardous waste incinerator, because I think that places us in a time frame that says we've actually been at this for a while.
But if you use the stories like, they're anecdotes of one company's experience, I don't think you sit there and say, well, put up the CS's website.
Right.
That would be
Yeah.
overdone. But,
Mhm.
saying some of the stories that you said, I think you could get by.
I think, and
It adds,
yeah.
it adds to the education.
Yeah.
from-
Part of it.
So close to the
Mhm.
speaker that
Yeah.
doesn't hurt the people.
Do you
Right.
Oh, I got something out of
Do
it.
you share
Yeah.
all the stories though, or some of them just for us? or-
Well, I think most of them were for
Obviously
you.
the
For,
China one probably would be one
Yeah.
to share.
yeah, most of them were for you to have a background of, again, so that you would have the confidence that when you go out here, we didn't just put the presentation together, so it's just not all fluffy green paint, that there's substance and form behind it. And then generally there is an opportunity, usually 3 or 4 people stay back, and you have an opportunity to speak with them and go from there.
So this is the one that you gave to Turner? So we
Yes.
could assume- Did any of them, were they architects that needed that credit, or?
No, they
just
were
like-
lead APs.
Oh, okay.
Because this qualifies as a live presentation. It doesn't have a GBCI number, but there are qualifications, and I have paperwork that I take with me and that you can get from Liz Larson for the 1 hour of credentialing maintenance point. And then also for the AIA, you take along a sign-up sheet, and those wanting the AIA credit will put their name on the sign-up sheet as well as their AIA number. And then also required from AIA is an evaluation form, so you have a chance to get that feedback as to what you can do. Part of the motivation to change to more professionally done slides was the first AIA that I did was at HKS in Dallas, and I think at least 3 or 4 of the designers said, you need to get better slides. So, I mean, it did its job. Gave me a sense of what needed to be done. And then when you bring back the sign-up sheet, we only have, I think, a very short period of time, like maybe 5 days, 3 to 5 days, to get that person's name entered into the AIA website so it can begin to, and they can ask for an actual certificate, or they can ask just for the acknowledgement of the point or the hour of training that they've received. And I'm available if you want me to do this again. If it's, for me it's 3 years of chattering on about this stuff and being involved in it. So that's why I've never put the notes in there. And I don't know that I'm probably pretty much said the same thing each time, but my guess is it's varied a bit, and just not terribly disciplined at doing that. And you can use,
How soon will you have this video available?
you could just do the raw video. I mean, it doesn't have to be,
I can have this available right
What about if we give separate, what if we just give the separate?
They can be separate.
Yeah, so you just take the slides and me chattering on and boil it down into less chatter.
Yeah, I can have that available immediately. The
All
finalized
right.
version of the video.
Yeah. I've never really had anyone say, okay, what exactly are you doing at your site? I just generally give an overview that recycling, composting, all of our copy paper is 100% recycled, FSC certified, those things, but it's rare that I've had anyone say, exactly what are you doing? So if you need a list of things, I don't have it, but I can make it.
Well,
Oh, Christine has the list. And yeah, because
and
Chris,
our history of, our company history, what we've done is always nice.
yeah, and yeah, Christine has done the Practice Green Health applications. So each year she lists the things that we've done differently or additionally, and that would give you some good talking points just to have, in your repertoire. All right. Okay, cool.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.